Ronan reached across his daughter to close the window blind so she wouldn't have to watch the mountain drop away on the left side of the car. His hand found the edge of the plastic frame and stopped. The vibration was wrong. Not the steady rhythm of steel on rail that a person absorbed into their body after the first hour until it became indistinguishable from their own pulse. Something else moved underneath it, a low, asymmetric shudder, arriving in a pattern that repeated with the mechanical consistency of something that had learned this rhythm from a fault in its own design. 3 pulses even, 1 beat fractionally longer. 3 pulses even, 1 beat longer. He felt it in his palm where it rested against the wall panel. He felt it through the seat beneath him. Della had fallen asleep against his shoulder somewhere east of Jasper. She was 10 years old, and she had spent 2 days convincing herself that a train trip through the Rockies was an adventure and not, as she had privately understood it, the longest stretch of time she had ever spent away from the neighborhood in Edmonton where her mother had lived and where everything that remained of her mother still lived. In the specific geography of known streets and familiar smells. She had decided to be brave. The decision had cost her something, and the cost showed in the way she had finally let herself sleep, with the absolute surrender of a child who had used up her available reserves of composure and had nothing left to spend on vigilance. Ronan looked at her. He looked back at the wall panel where his hand still rested. He did not panic. He had spent too many years learning the difference between noise and signal to let his heart do the thinking. What he felt instead was the quiet, certain recognition of a man who had seen this particular shape of signal before. In test data, in simulation models, in the careful language of a 35-page technical report he had written 11 years ago and which had produced, in sequence, a committee, a revised committee, a restructuring, and a silence that had lasted every day since. When Stephanie Kowalski came through the car on her scheduled passenger check, walking with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long since stopped registering individual faces as anything more than a checklist of needs and non-issues, Ronan raised one hand. Not urgently, the calm, deliberate signal of a man with something specific to say. Stephanie turned her professional smile toward him. She took in the practiced way of someone whose career had trained her to read a cabin in 3 seconds, the worn canvas jacket, the sleeping child, the faint shadows under his eyes, that spoke of a man who had been managing more than a train trip for a considerable period of time. She assessed and filed the result, without being aware she had done either. Ronan told her about the vibration. He described the pattern, 3 beats even, 1 beat longer, and the way it was coming not from the normal rail contact rhythm, but from somewhere lower. From the bogie assembly beneath the car ahead, he thought, carrying into the frame at a frequency inconsistent with straight-track travel. Stephanie leaned slightly in the way of someone performing attentiveness. She straightened back up. She told him it was just the mountain grades, that the sound was perfectly normal on this section of the route, that everything had been inspected at the Edmonton Maintenance Depot before departure. Ronan said, with the same measured calm, that a standard depot inspection checked brake wear, wheel profile, and coupling integrity. It was not designed to identify harmonic resonance patterns in compressed suspension under variable gradient load. He said the pattern he was hearing was consistent with micro-fatigue in a spring housing, and that the behavior would change, would amplify, on the descent grades approaching Vancouver, particularly through the canyon sections where curve radius and gradient combined. He asked her please to notify the engineer's cab. Stephanie Kowalski was not a careless person. She had worked this route for 7 years, and she cared about her passengers with a genuine warmth that her professional manner sometimes obscured. But she had also, in 7 years, developed an understanding of a certain type of passenger, anxious, over-researched, the kind of person who read accident reports online and arrived at the station already primed to find something wrong. The man in seat 14B fit a profile that experience had taught her to manage efficiently and with minimal escalation. She told him, in a voice that carried just enough to be heard in the surrounding rows, that she appreciated his concern, but that passengers were not generally in a position to diagnose mechanical conditions from inside the car, and that the train was in the care of trained professionals. A man in a gray business blazer 3 rows forward, Scott Haskell, who had introduced himself to the woman beside him as a project manager from Vancouver, returning from a week of client meetings, and who had mentioned twice that he had a dinner reservation at 7, turned in his seat with a faint, indulgent smile. A woman across the aisle shook her head slightly in the direction of the window. Della stirred at the change in her father's posture. She didn't wake fully, but children learn to read their parents at a cellular level, and something in the shift of Ronan's shoulder against her cheek brought her up from sleep just enough to hear the end of Stephanie's sentence. She didn't open her eyes, but she pulled her chin down toward her collarbone in the particular way of a child who has decided that not seeing something is the next best thing to it not having happened. Ronan felt the small change in his daughter the way a person feels a shift in air pressure. He looked at her. He looked back at Stephanie Kowalski. He said quietly that he was not asking her to believe him. He was only asking her to pass the observation to someone with the authority to make the call. He said the consequences of checking and finding nothing were a brief delay. He said he thought she understood the alternative. Stephanie reached for her radio with the manner of someone managing a disruption rather than responding to information. She pressed the call button and reported to the operations coach that there was a passenger in car 4 who believed he had found a problem with the train. In the operations coach at the rear of the train, Gilbert Tran was reviewing maintenance cycle logs on his tablet with the methodical attention of someone who had chosen this inspection trip precisely because the paperwork never quite told him what riding the actual train told him. He was the Chief Rail Safety Officer for Via Rail's Western Division, a title that had taken 22 years to arrive at, and that he wore with the particular seriousness of a man who had spent those years learning how small the gap was between a near miss and something worse. He heard Stephanie's report. He asked her to repeat the passenger's name. There was a pause on the radio. She didn't have the name, she said. She had the seat number. Gilbert asked her to check the manifest. She checked. She read out the name associated with seat 14B, car 4. Ronan Keefe. Gilbert set his tablet down on the seat beside him. He sat for a moment without moving. Then he stood and walked forward through 3 cars, moving against the gentle sway of the train with the practiced ease of someone whose body knew this rhythm without his mind having to manage it. He stopped at row 14. The man sitting there was not what the name had assembled in Gilbert's mind over the years. The author of the Keefe Bogey Resonance Report, the document Gilbert had assigned as required reading in every safety briefing he had led for the past 4 years, had existed in Gilbert's professional imagination as something institutional and distant, the way foundational documents tend to. The man in seat 14B was wearing a canvas jacket with a frayed left cuff, sitting beside a sleeping child, watching Gilbert's approach with the careful, still expression of someone who had learned not to expect much from the approach of authority figures. Gilbert asked him directly whether he was the Ronan Keefe who had filed the primary suspension resonance report at CRT Engineering 11 years ago. The car went quiet in the particular way of shared spaces, when something is clearly happening that the people in them don't yet have a framework for. Stephanie Kowalski, standing 3 rows back, did not move. Ronan said yes. He said it the way a person acknowledges a fact they have carried for a long time without it being acknowledged in return. Not with bitterness, not with relief, just with the flat, honest weight of something true. Gilbert said, "Show me." Ronan pressed his palm flat against the wall panel and nodded once. Gilbert crouched slightly and did the same. 5 seconds. 6. He raised his head. Then he turned and walked back toward the operations coach. And the way he walked, with a purpose that had not been there before, was noticed by several people in the car who had not previously been paying attention. What Ronan Keefe had been, before he became a man in a frayed jacket in a coach seat, was not a story he offered to people. Not because he was ashamed of it, because the version of the story that was true was too complicated to fit into the ordinary architecture of conversation, and the simplified version always came out wrong. It came out sounding like martyrdom or grievance. And he was neither a martyr nor a man consumed by grievance. He was simply someone who had seen a thing clearly, said so, and had paid a price for the saying that he had not finished paying yet. He had spent 9 years at CRT Engineering in Calgary, doing the kind of structural dynamics analysis that existed at the intersection of mathematics and intuition, studying how materials behaved under repeated load cycles, how tolerances acceptable in year 1 accumulated into failure modes in year 8, how the signals that preceded a catastrophic event were almost always present and almost always ignored. He was good at it, genuinely, uncomplicatedly good at it, with the kind of pattern recognition that could not be entirely taught, the ability to look at data and feel the shape of what it was pointing toward before the numbers had fully resolved. The resonance report had come out of 18 months of analysis, following a series of minor derailments across 3 Canadian operators that official investigations had each attributed to track irregularities and operator error. Ronan had looked at the data from a different angle and seen something the official investigations had not been looking for. A consistent harmonic failure pattern in a spring housing design that one manufacturer supplied to all 3 operators. Under normal conditions, the design was fine. Under the combined stress of sustained gradient descent and curve loading, the exact conditions present on mountain rail routes, it produced a resonance cycle that accelerated fatigue fracturing beyond what the standard inspection interval was built to catch. He had written the report after trying twice through internal channels to escalate the finding. The first attempt produced a committee. The second produced a different committee with the same conclusion. The report went further than the internal process had permitted him to go. He documented the failure sequence in full. He documented the conditions under which it manifested. He submitted it to Transport Canada and sent copies to 2 operators he could identify as using the affected component. 6 weeks later, CRT Engineering's legal team described the report as speculative analysis produced outside his authorized scope, and his continued insistence on the finding as conduct incompatible with project continuity. There was a restructuring. His position was eliminated. There was no documentation connecting the 2 events. By then, Annie had been watching the slow contraction of their finances and his increasing absorption in the fight with an exhaustion that had its own logic. She didn't leave him for it. She got sick instead, the way people get sick when the body finally stops holding something at bay, and she was gone in 14 months. He had Della, who was 6, and a half-empty house in Calgary, and the particular silence of a man who has been loud about something important for long enough that silence becomes the only remaining option. He moved to Edmonton. He found work maintaining industrial equipment at a processing facility north of the city because the mechanical intuition that had made him useful in rail engineering did not disappear just because the rail engineering industry had made him unwelcome. He did not speak about the report. He made Della's lunches and attended her school concerts and drove her to swimming lessons on Thursday evenings. And when she asked him questions about the machines he worked on, he answered them honestly and in full because she was the one person in his life who listened to his answers the way answers deserved to be listened to. Della had been awake when Gilbert walked back through the car. She had been awake since he crouched beside her father's seat, and she had understood with the precise comprehension of a 10-year-old who had spent 4 years learning to read rooms, that something important was shifting. She didn't know what her father had written 11 years ago. She didn't know what a bogey assembly was, but she knew the difference between the way people looked at her father when he picked her up from school in the truck with the cracked windshield, and the way the man in the rail authority vest was looking at him now. And the gap between those two things was wide enough to make the back of her throat feel strange. She took out the small notebook she carried in her jacket pocket, a habit she had picked up from watching her father write things down, measurements and observations, in the small green notebooks he kept on the kitchen shelf, and held it in her lap without opening it. The train slowed through a long, descending curve and came to a stop at a small station called Clearwater Junction that was not on the scheduled itinerary. The platform was narrow, and the mountains on either side of the valley were enormous in the late afternoon light. A Via Rail maintenance crew arrived in a gray utility truck within 20 minutes. There were two of them. The senior technician, Roy MacDougall, had 14 years with Via Rail's mountain maintenance division, a man with the particular unhurried competence of someone who had learned a long time ago that appearing calm was the most useful thing you could do in situations where everyone else was the opposite. The younger technician with him had the focused attention of someone still building the internal library of patterns that only time could make automatic. Roy looked at the bogey assembly on Car 3. He looked at it again. He asked his colleague for the acoustic resonance analyzer from the truck kit. What the analyzer found was not catastrophic in the immediate sense. The spring housing on Bogey 3C showed microfracturing in a fatigue pattern, consistent with approximately 600 hours of resonance loading beyond design tolerance, concentrated along the upper mounting bracket, where load transfer during curve entry created the harmonic Ronan had described. On level track, or on the grades east of the Rockies, it was a manageable condition. On the descent into the Fraser Canyon, the next 6 hours of this route, under the curve radii and gradient combinations specific to that section, the failure probability moved from theoretical to something Roy MacDougall was not willing to characterize as acceptable. He took photographs. He and his colleague spoke briefly and quietly. Then he turned to Gilbert Tran and said that the affected car would need to be decoupled and that the maintenance code on that spring housing component had been flagged in a service bulletin update 3 years prior. The flag had been addressed, but the inspection interval had defaulted to the standard cycle rather than the enhanced one the bulletin had recommended. The bulletin's language had been advisory rather than mandatory. 3 years of standard inspections had passed over exactly the kind of gradual fatigue accumulation the enhanced protocol was designed to catch. Audrey Sinclair, a Transport Canada rail safety inspector assigned to the BC Interior District, arrived at Clearwater Junction 40 minutes later. She reviewed Roy's photographs and the component maintenance records, and asked Gilbert a series of questions in a tone that established clearly and without hostility that she was now the person whose questions needed to be answered. She asked to speak with the passenger who had identified the vibration. She found Ronan on the platform, with Della beside him, sitting on a wooden bench, watching the maintenance crew work. She approached him the way a competent investigator approaches someone who possesses directly relevant knowledge. Without condescension, without surprise, with the simple efficiency of someone who understands that the most useful thing she can do is listen accurately. She introduced herself. She said she intended to cross-reference the service bulletin deviation with the original Keefe report. She said that if the failure pattern was present across other vehicles in the Western Division maintenance pool, the scope of the review would need to be expanded accordingly. Ronan listened to this and felt something he did not immediately have a name for. Not vindication, exactly, not satisfaction, something quieter. The particular feeling of a thing that has been true for a long time finally being in a room where it is allowed to be true. He had not boarded this train to be right about anything. He had come to get Della to Vancouver to see her grandparents, Annie's parents, who were in their 70s and had been asking since Christmas when they were coming. He had bought coach tickets because that was what he could afford, and because it did not especially matter to him where he sat. He said what he thought needed to be said, that the service bulletin deviation was almost certainly not isolated to this car or this maintenance pool, that the operational culture which had produced it, the chronic prioritization of turnaround time over enhanced inspection protocols, whenever the protocol language gave any room for interpretation, was systemic. A review which addressed the specific component without addressing the culture would produce a finding without a fix. Audrey took notes. She was the kind of person who took notes, which Ronan recognized as a quality shared by everyone he had ever trusted. Maurice Pelletier, Via Rail's Western Division Operations Manager, arrived at the station by car from Kamloops 90 minutes into the delay. He had spent 16 years managing the operational complexity of one of the world's most challenging rail corridors and arrived prepared to be decisive and professionally even-handed. He was not prepared for the conversation he walked into. He was even less prepared for the name that Gilbert mentioned when explaining how the vibration had been identified. Morris had encountered the Keefe report only once, in a safety audit citation 3 years prior. He had not thought about the citation since. He stood on the platform at Clearwater Junction and experienced the specific disorientation of a footnote becoming a person, and that person being the man in the canvas jacket whom one of his conductors had told to leave the matter to trained professionals. He found Ronan near the end of the platform as the maintenance crew finished their work. He said that Via Rail was reviewing its maintenance communication protocols. He said that the service bulletin deviation would be fully documented and reported to Transport Canada, he said, with the careful phrasing of someone who had workshopped the sentence, that the way Ronan's initial report had been received on the train did not reflect the organization's values. He said the division was assembling an independent safety advisory panel and asked whether Ronan would consider a consulting role. Ronan did not answer immediately. He looked through the waiting room window at the platform, where the mountains caught the last of the afternoon light, in a way that made the snow on the high ridges look lit from inside. He thought about the offer the way he had trained himself to think about most things. Not with the fast reflexive response of someone who already knew what they wanted, but with the slower, more disciplined attention of someone who had learned that the first answer was not always the honest one. He had been hurt by this industry, not dramatically, not all at once, in layers, each layer confirming the previous one, like the kind of fatigue fracturing he had spent years learning to recognize. The offer of a consulting role from an organization whose employee had publicly dismissed him in front of his daughter was not an uncomplicated thing to accept. He also thought about Della. She was sitting outside on the bench with a granola bar from her pack and the notebook open in her lap, writing something with the focused concentration she brought to things she considered worth getting right. She would start grade 5 in September. She had asked him, the night before they boarded the train, whether his job at the processing plant was important. He had answered honestly, it was useful and he was good at it. But it was not the work he had built himself to do. He said that he would consider the consulting role under 3 specific conditions. He said, first, that the passenger-facing staff training needed to address not only the technical characteristics of safety observations, but the non-discriminatory handling of them. The value of what someone reported was entirely independent of what they were wearing or what class of ticket they were holding. Any training failing to address this was not adequate training, he said. Second, that the findings from today needed to be shared across the National Rail Maintenance Network rather than resolved internally, because the operational pressure that had produced the inspection deviation was not specific to this division. A systemic problem treated as an individual incident would simply recur. He said, third, that his original report from CRT Engineering needed to be formally incorporated into current technical standards, not because he required recognition, but because the document contained documented analysis that had been sitting unused for 11 years, while the industry it had tried to protect continued operating. Morris said all three conditions were ones he could take seriously and pursue formally. Ronan said he would wait for a formal proposal. He said he was not willing to come back to this industry to prove something he already knew was true. He was only willing to come back if coming back produced outcomes that actually changed the probability of something going wrong on one of these trains. He left the waiting room and found Della on the bench. She closed her notebook when he sat down beside her, which meant she had finished whatever she was writing. She looked up at the mountains, which had lost most of their direct light and stood against the sky in layers of blue and gray that reminded him of how Annie used to describe them. In the language of someone who had grown up in the flat middle of the country and could not stop being surprised by things this large. He said he thought they would make Vancouver by morning on the substitute car. Della said that was fine. She asked, without looking at him, whether any of this, the stop, the inspection, the conversations with all the people in vests, had helped, whether it mattered. He thought about how to answer the way he thought about most of what she asked him, honestly, and without making it simpler than it was. He said he thought so. He said that some things that mattered took a long time to be treated as if they mattered. He said that today had been a small piece of a long correction. She said okay. She said it with the considered gravity of a 10-year-old absorbing information she wasn't ready to fully process yet, filing it in the place where she kept things she intended to return to. Stephanie Kowalski found Ronan near the substitute car before boarding resumed. She had spent the better part of 2 hours deciding what to say and had arrived at the conclusion that whatever she said would be insufficient, which meant the only question was whether insufficient was better than silent. She said she hadn't known who he was. Ronan looked at her for a moment and said she hadn't needed to know who he was. She had only needed to pass it on. He said it without heat. He said it the way a person states a principle they have applied consistently enough that it no longer requires emotional reinforcement. She was quiet. She had been prepared for a version of this conversation where apology and acceptance were the entire transaction. What she was not prepared for was the sense that the conversation was about something the transaction couldn't close. She turned to Della and apologized to her directly, which she had not planned to do, but which felt, once she started, like the part that most needed to be said. Della looked at her and said, with the specific conditional generosity of 10 years, "It's okay." Ronan told Stephanie that if she wanted to do something useful with what the afternoon had been, the most useful thing was not the apology. It was building the habit of passing the observation up rather than closing it at the point of contact, because the point of contact was not always where the relevant knowledge lived. She said she understood. He said, what happened the next time a passenger said something that made her impatient would be a better measure of understanding than anything she said right now. She absorbed this without looking away. That, he thought, was something. Scott Haskell found Ronan at the platform's charging station and introduced himself not as the project manager with the dinner reservation, but as the man who had turned around in his seat and smiled, and who was now glad the train had stopped. Ronan shook his hand. He did not say it was no problem, because it had been a problem, just not the kind Scott had initially thought. When Gilbert Tran found Ronan at the door of the substitute car and extended his hand, he said he had run the Keefe report as required reading in his safety briefings for 4 consecutive years. He said that reading a document about a person and then watching that same person identify a harmonic resonance pattern from a coach seat by pressing his palm against the wall panel were 2 different kinds of education, and that he had needed both. Ronan shook his hand. He said the report had never been the point. The point was what the report was about, and what it was about was the same today as it had been 11 years ago. The industry was still deciding whether it wanted to pay attention to small signals before they became large ones, or after. Gilbert nodded once, the way a person nods when they have understood something they don't need to improve on. The substitute car was slightly newer, with overhead lighting a fraction warmer in tone. Della claimed the same window seat she had occupied since Edmonton, which Ronan found significant in a way he didn't try to name. She pressed her face against the glass and watched the platform at Clearwater Junction fall away, and the maintenance crew packing up their equipment and the small station building with its single light coming on in the dusk. Ronan settled in beside her. He ran his hands once along the armrest the way he always did, attentively, not anxiously, the habitual orientation of a man who notices the physical world he inhabits. Della took out her notebook. She opened it to the page she had been writing on earlier and read over what she had written. She closed it again and held it in both hands in her lap and looked out at the mountains, which had gone blue and enormous in the failing light, and the river running fast and pale through the valley below, and the last of the day rising in thin gold lines along the highest ridges. The train held its speed through the grade, and the suspension beneath them was even and steady, and the rhythm in the wheels against the rail was only the ordinary rhythm of a system functioning as it was designed to function, maintained by people doing their work with the care that work required. In the weeks that followed, Via Rail completed an expanded inspection of 23 vehicles across the Western Division, identified 2 additional spring housings requiring component-level replacement, and filed a comprehensive deviation report with Transport Canada. Audrey Sinclair's office cross-referenced the findings with the original Keefe report and submitted a formal citation to the National Rail Engineering Standards Archive, where it was reclassified from the informal submission category it had occupied for 11 years to a referenced technical finding. It was a small administrative change. Ronan read the notification on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table in Edmonton while Della finished her homework at the other end, and he did not say anything about it aloud. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat with it for a while before he got up to check whether the dishwasher had finished. The formal consulting proposal arrived from Maurice Pelletier's office on the last Thursday of September. Ronan read it at his workbench during lunch, beside a pump housing he was rebuilding for the processing facility. The proposal included all 3 of the conditions he had set, translated into the formal language of employment agreements. He called the school to ask about the November career presentation schedule. When Della came home that afternoon, he told her he was thinking about going back to a kind of work he used to do. She asked what kind. He said work that involved making sure the trains people rode were safe to ride. She thought about this. She said, like what you did on the mountain. He said something like that. She nodded slowly, with the careful, integrating judgment of a child, who was still updating her understanding of her father, and had not yet finished deciding what the update meant. Then she went to get a snack. He accepted the consulting role on a part-time basis, structured around Della's school schedule, with the formal review of his original report written into the engagement terms. He did not accept it to be vindicated. He did not accept it to be known. He accepted it because there was a version of the industry that could be made less likely to do what it had done on that train in the Rockies, less likely to create the conditions under which a conductor's practiced taxonomy of passengers and a maintenance crew's scheduling pressure and a service bulletin's advisory, language could all converge on the same afternoon and come within a canyon descent of producing an outcome no one on that train had wanted. And if the path to that version ran through his particular knowledge and his particular willingness to walk back into rooms that had once been arranged to exclude him, then that was the work. That had always, he supposed, been the work. On the morning of Della's school career presentation, she stood at the front of the classroom, with the small, serious composure of a child who had thought carefully about what she wanted to say. She introduced her father not as the man who fixed industrial equipment, and not as the man who used to work in rail safety, but as the man who had put his hand against the wall of a train in the mountains and decided that what he felt was worth saying out loud, even when the people around him had decided it wasn't. Ronan sat in the back of the room in a chair designed for someone approximately 1/3 his size, and he listened to his daughter describe him. And he felt something he had not felt in a long time. The simple absence of a weight he had carried so consistently he had stopped being aware of it as weight at all. That evening, the page Della had written on the bench at Clearwater Junction was still there in her notebook, unchanged. She had written, "My dad feels things other people walk past." She never showed it to him, but she kept the notebook on her shelf, beside the window, where the light could find it in the morning.